Everybody.
It's Dr. Nicole Carter,
And
and
Bree, back again.
today or actually this evening, we are going through part two of Toni Morrison's Playing in the Dark. Part two is actually Romancing the Shadow. So we'll be talking about um, Blackness and the white literary imagination, the American dream, some different topics related to those things. And I could kick it off, but before we start, make sure to go ahead and pick up your syllabus from the website, smartbrowngirl.com, and join us, read along, and get into this particular discussion. So, to start off, the quote in the syllabus, I believe it's page 15 of the syllabus, but from page 48 of the book, um, reads Morrison discussing New World versus Old World. The need to establish difference stemmed not only from the old world, but from a difference in the new. What was distinctive in the new was, first of all, its claim to freedom, and second, the presence of the unfree within the heart of the democratic experiment, the critical absence of democracy, its echo, shadow, and silent force in the political and intellectual activity of some not Americans. The distinguishing features of the not Americans were their slave status, their social status, and their color. Again, that was page 48. Um, and the first question actually relates to something that's brought up on page 33 in the text. But that quote that was just read kind of uh, really provides an overview or summary of this section or this chapter of the book. So, the first question that we'll be discussing today is, how does the quote American dream of early America relate to how we understand the American dream now? And how is a dream of America already informed by race, gender, class, sexuality, ability, and other things? So,
I'm
you want
al-
to go ahead?
yeah, I'm almost getting deja vu, Dr. Carter, because I feel like the last time we were on live, we were doing Hortense Spillers together about the American dream, right? That same sort of Hortense Spillers calls the same thing into question, where she's like questioning gender, especially as we got in that piece from Spillers, she's talking about the Middle Passage. And here, Morrison is sort of evoking that same early imagery of like the foundations of America.
Mhm.
Point that CJ is pushing us to on page 33, it comes at the bottom. Um, and it's this passage that begins in that last paragraph where Morrison writes, Young America distinguished itself by and understood itself to be pressing toward a future of freedom, a kind of human dignity believed unprecedented in the world. A whole tradition of universal yearnings collapsed into that well-fondled phrase, the American dream. Although this immigrant dream deserves the exhaustive scrutiny it has received in the scholarly disciplines and the arts, it is just as important to know what these people were rushing from as it is to know what they were hastening to. If the new world fed dreams, what was the old world reality that whetted the appetite for them? And how did that reality caress and grip the shaping of a new one? So she's talking about this tension of like the people who founded, settled, right, as we understand colonialism, the new America, the new world, were also fleeing their own sorts of religious persecution, but that religious persecution did not take into account this, I think Morrison calls it this Africanism, right? So she's talking about this new world is being created as the antithesis to this Africanism. So they know that they don't want the new world to be their old world of European religious persecution, but they also know they don't want to be the savages. Is
Mhm.
what Morrison is saying, right? She's like, they understand power because they understood they didn't have any. They crossed the Atlantic Ocean to try to get some. And then they dealt with this this journey of colonization and forming a colony. Um, and so I think that when we talk about our contemporary American dream, it's very much still like wedded up in that of that you get this classic image of the white picket fence in the suburbs with the green grass and the what people say 2.5 kids and a dog.
Mhm.
And it's very much like this. Even the suburbs are like the closest contemporary thing I can think of to like colonies. Like when I think of settlers, I think of almost this like timeline to the suburbs of like you're establishing your little settlement. It has your grocery store, your park, your dog park, but it's this enclosed space. And so when we talk about space in relation to what Morrison is writing, I think the new and old American dream are very similar of that people with wealth and whiteness want their own sequestered geographies where they know that they're not the other anymore.
And that's interesting that you brought up geographies because that's something that we don't often think of, like in terms of space. So I do think that we think of housing, like when we think of the American dream, but I guess like land is not necessarily like this moving from to a completely different space is not necessarily part of that. And then another component is like this indoctrination of folks of color into this idea of the American dream that
Mm-hmm.
is still based upon those same principles, even though it's extremely difficult to attain something that was not created for you to attain. So,
Yeah.
you know,
And the indoctrination runs deep. Like even I had a moment of reflection the other day in relation to my nieces and like Disney princesses. I'm like, what does it mean that like so much of Disney is about princesses and monarchy, right? Like if we take it deep and we really pull out these threads, like we get groomed into the American dream and wanting to be like individualized success so early because you get like your Cinderella stories quite literally of like the prince will come find you and put a glass slipper on your feet and you'll get moved into the castle and your life is horrible when you're not in the castle. And so the way that you succeed, right, is by being the people in the castle. We don't really get taught about collective sort of work and effort and that you can stay in the community you're born in. Because another part of that American dream, since you talked about geographies, is a lot of the American dream like is tethered to the idea that you have to move somewhere else. Like you have to get out of where you grew up. And it's almost always this evocative like New England, I think, almost image like of the suburbs. Like it's not even like Midwestern or like West Coast. It's very like I imagine like people aspire to like Vermont and Maine, maybe
mhm,
not in name, but when you're talking about that image of the green grass and all that other stuff, that geography is distinctly like East Coast suburb of a major city. You got your lawyers, the people who work in government, like things like that. And I'm so here, the location, right? This idea of being othered is everything that isn't white, wealthy, suburban, private school, or well-funded, big public schools, right?
yeah. And then you brought up, you think of like New England, like that type of, I guess, space. And thinking of the people that she's writing about in this text, many of them were like living and writing and like creating this or manifesting this dream in that area. So um so it I mean that was what they were mimicking or writing about, and now we still have that same idea of what the American dream is supposed to be and supposed to look like. So do you think that this is an additional question. So do you think that the American dream is actually attainable
I
for
think
those who have been othered? Let me just add.
okay. I was about to say, thank you for that clarifier, Dr. Carter, because I'm thinking of I've had a discussion with people recently about how like anti-Blackness in particular makes Black people think that if you succeed in wealth and in capitalism, you can almost distance yourself from anti-Blackness. Like if you make enough money, they'll treat you differently. And I think we get these tropes over and over again in film and music, like people thinking once they make it, they won't be met with anti-Black violence. But something will always bring you back to anti-Blackness, right? Like you even get like classic stories of like when celebrities go to places where people don't recognize them and they don't know they have money and they get treated the same as if you were a regular Black person, right? And so while wealth may give you a momentary like release from anti-Blackness, it does not bring you out of that anti-Black vacuum. So like aspiring to wealth and power, what does that do? Like the example, and I'm going to tie it back to New England, like Henry Louis Gates got pulled over.
Yes, I was about to say that.
And like, so if we're talking about the American dream, particularly this text, because I think this was published through Harvard. I think it was actually a lecture she gave that they
It was a group, several lectures, and then they put it together.
Yes. So I'm even thinking about like if we're really taking it and building off of your point about like the people that she's writing about, taking it even further, like the Ivies as like the American dream as an institution, where are most of Ivy League institutions located, if not New England, these East Coast colonial spaces? And why are the Ivies there? Because those were the 13 original colonies, right? So like when we talk about these timelines, it's literally a direct line because the Harvard of our contemporary moment is the Harvard, the Columbia of slave owning, right, families. The Ivy Leaves are so thick and so strong because they have been there for hundreds of years, because these institutions were deeply invested in colonialism. They were deeply tied to these violences. And so when you get professors, literally like Henry Louis Gates, who get stopped and pulled over while teaching at a Harvard, and you're trying to do this credentialism thing with the police, and then eventually you sit down with like the police officer who harmed you and President Obama at this table. And even in all that power, you still got pulled over. You still got impacted by state violence. So even with all of those credentials, all of that access, anti-Blackness was still at Skip Gase's door.
Was it that he got pulled over, or was he at his house? I thought he was at his house.
Follow home in the
and it's like, so I can't even be me in my house. Like this is the epitome of what you call the American dream, having a home that I own. I have a career that helps me own this space, and you're intruding upon that space because I'm the other that she talks about in the text. Like I'm not supposed to be here. So, yeah.
And that connects us right to our next question that CJ leads us to, number 3 of how does the image of impenetrable whiteness compare to the darkness Morrison describes in early American literature? And that is from, I underlined it. That's also 133. It's right above the American Dream passage, where Morrison says, these images of impenetrable whiteness need contextualizing to explain their extraordinary power, pattern, and consistency, because they appear almost always in conjunction with representations of Black or Africanist people who are dead, impotent, or under complete control. These images of blinding whiteness seem to function as both antidote and meditation on the shadow that is companion to this whiteness, a dark and abiding presence that moves the hearts and texts of American literature with fear and longing, right? So another part of our American dream conversation is what makes the American dream appealing is that the ghetto exists, right? If the ghetto, if the hood, right, if the trap did not exist, you would not aspire to be a Henry Louis Gates living in the suburbs. So even when we get an impenetrable whiteness as a space of the suburbs, it is made possible because you have this Black shadowy image, right, of the hood, of the ghetto, of where you know not to be. So even take this to our contemporary, leading off with our first questions of the American dream now, you're talking about literature, and Toni Morrison's work here about the shadow can be extended to all types of literature. So I think here she's almost exclusively talking about print text, but music is literature. Our media and our visual art as imaginative and visual literature, right? And thinking about the scenes we get, even if we go to poetry from like Claudia Rankin Citizen and all of that, we constantly get these images of impenetrable whiteness, which are wealth, which are different geographic spaces. And then you get this dark, abiding presence of the
Mhm.
fear and longing that is Blackness.
Yeah. And it's like the whiteness always has to be in control, right? Like in order to remain in power. So, or in like in the state that it is. So even when a black person, like we mentioned, Henry Louis Gates, is law abiding, minding his business, upstanding citizen, like stereotypically an upstanding citizen,
Mm-hmm.
um, there has to be force used to make sure to demonstrate that you are still darkness, right? Like you are still uh like opposite of who we are. So not talking about me, but like just
Yeah.
whiteness. So um yeah, I don't it's a lot there. And I like the question that continues this a little bit later that talks about the shadow and echoes and, you know, like all of these things. Um, but, hmm, but
Impenetrable whiteness is such a strong image, like this impenetrable bubble of whiteness, because you can think of it as white like literary universes that don't have no black characters, no of color characters, and white authors, as Morrison said, were able to write that with this like Africanist shadow on their mind and like looming in the background. Like she talks about different novels that we get that are foundational to the white literary imagination, but there's these moments of shadow, like there's these moments of like, I know she talks about Huckleberry Finn and Mark Twain, and she's like, these white literary universes are even made possible by the darkness
yeah.
that.
Well, whiteness as a concept, like as a construct, would not be without the othering of well, black folks and before that, indigenous folks. Like it was literally constructed to demonstrate that there was a difference to, you know, subject others to say that my myself as a white person or whiteness period is greater than and so like in literature but in reality like because these things mimic literature mimics often reality. You know, these things are constructed and reconstructed to demonstrate that there are vast differences.
Right.
Um, and so that's where the you know the shadow of darkness comes in, and all of these texts, and they seem to disrupt. Um, you know, it's like they're disrupting, and then there's something that whiteness has to endure and engage in order to bring things back in line. So,
And she talks about that on page 35 and bringing that back to these literary foundations, right? On 35, that final paragraph where she begins, the body of literature produced by the young nation is one way it inscribed its transaction with these fears, forces, and hopes. And it is difficult to read the literature of young America without being struck by how antithetical it is to our modern rendition of the American dream, how pronounced in it is the absence of that term's elusive mixture of hope, realism, materialism, and promise. For a people who made much of their newness, their potential, freedom, and innocence, it is striking how dour, how troubled, how frightened and haunted our early and founding literature truly is. And so she's talking about this haunting that is like, y'all are writing all of these beautiful stories about freedom and exploration and power, and y'all got slaves in the field right now. Like, how does that? And I think she's getting at like even when we talk about the imagination, we're talking about the psyche. She's like, how are you writing all of these novels, these poems, these literary ideas about freedom, and you have slaves in the field right now? She's like, what?
not only that though, like how are you doing these things and you're perpetuating the same things that you were running from? Come on now. Like how? How you know? How are you subjecting people, human beings, to the same things that you endured yourself, that you were running from? Like you were enduring religious persecution and among other things. And you ran away from that to establish a newness, to establish some ounce of freedom, and then you take away the freedom of all other people who are unlike you. So like,
Come on now.
but yeah.
And she
Whew.
gets into that on the next page, right? She talks about these words that are common in early American literature. Like I remember vividly being in high school and having to read like Heart of Darkness. What else do we read? Everybody reads The Scarlet Letter, right? Like you go through your different periods of early American literature, and you're like, wow, where are the people who look like me or act like me, right? But they get all of these new categories of literary distinction, the Romantic period, right? We talk about Puritans escaping religious persecution, right? And you get into all of that imagery. And all the while, there's this image of darkness. Like Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad might be the starkest example because he's literally like, we got to go kill all the savages. We got
And
to
I
go.
think wasn't there a response to that? I think it was Jane Rice. Is that how you pronounce her name? Why So God So See? That was a response to it. It's a post-colonial text that
Yeah,
was written to like basically talk back to
I
Heart of
know there's
Darkness.
been a couple African authors in particular who have like when we get into African literature, like our African kin in the diaspora be penning, right?
Yeah. And
About
she was from I think South Africa, but yeah, like she responded to basically that text. That's actually one of my favorite books out of 50,000 of them. But yeah. So
yeah, and I was just gonna plug. I hope when people, if you are intrigued by Playing in the Dark, Whiteness in the Literary Imagination, burst open your literary canon and don't only read Black American, African American authors. Diasporic literature will
yes.
really change the way that you think about the American literary imagination because you're like, we have so much commitment to realism where diasporically we have magical realism. We have so much
Mhm.
going on with the way that Black folks talk about our Black universes.
We could be reading like I don't know. I read a lot, but I just like always think there's so many things I'm missing. And
Right?
a lot of it is actually that literature, like you know, but it expands our perspective and our imagination, which we're talking about. So,
Yeah. I'm
yeah.
so glad that this year in SBG we got into more like Nigerian authors. We
Yes.
more like magical realism texts, especially alongside us reading literary theory. It's like we're doing the literary theory analysis here in this live in this text, and then we're reading things like Freshwater, right? Then
Yeah.
we're reading things like The Other Black Girl, even right in thinking about the ways that Black people write, not just um, within like the American context of American literature, but thinking about how, like, as we said, magical realism and the things that we think about with Blackness diasporically,
Yeah.
Black people have always pushed the envelope of genre in text in literature, whether it be print or oral traditions. And I love how Morrison gets into that slightly when she talks about. Um, I think it might be in the third section, so I won't jump there again.
Okay. So let me go to I'll read the next one. So the next question asks, how does early America come to understand, conceive of human freedom? Did we do that one? I don't think we did.
We didn't do it explicitly, but we sort of danced around like y'all are actively enslaving folks after fleeing religious persecution.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we can go to the next one then. And it actually um, stems from a term used on page 37. But so that question asks, what does Morrison mean by surrogate selves? So I read this section and then I started like going down a rabbit hole, saying all these other things on the surrogate self. And really, it talks a lot of research on enslaved people and surrogacy, talked about motherhood in the surrogate self, and how, you know, Africans were a stand-in for, like I guess, like like temporarily in a mothering role, but
Yeah,
never truly considered mother, right? Like, so that aspect was only given to those considered to be human. So, but yeah, the surrogate selves, to me, like, I thought about the reality that anything. Um, Let me go back to the section where it talked about it. But basically, anything that was thought about and that wanted to be like explored could be done to the surrogate self, and that surrogate self was uh, enslaved Africans, right? So
right,
like, and it didn't matter how horrendous, because basically in their minds that's what they were there for. So, um, and I'm trying to think of where it was.
while you
Oh,
looking,
hmm.
I was gonna read the part where the quote is pulled from if you were going
Yeah,
there.
that's where I was looking for. It's on the bottom of
Yeah,
37,
yeah.
I think.
Where it starts, it's in the middle of that there is no romance paragraph.
Yeah.
It begins the slave population, it could be and was assumed, offered itself up as surrogate selves for meditation on problems of human freedom, its lore, and its elusiveness. This black population was available for meditations on terror, the terror of European outcasts, their dread of failure, powerlessness, nature without limits, natal loneliness, internal aggression, evil, sin, greed. In other words, this slave population was understood to have offered itself up for reflections on human freedom in terms other than the abstractions of human potential and the rights of man. So then we get into philosophy. Like then she talks about it, right? She gets into Orlando Patterson. I think that's also drawing on like philosophers whose names are eluding me right now when you talk about the rights of man and like human capital H as a
Mhm.
philosophical concept. She's like, so we know these people came from the old world to the new world. They're escaping religious persecution. They're outcasts in the Eastern and Western European sense, of the beef that white people had in Europe, right? And so they're trying to create this sense of self, and they take it out and they do this exploration at the expense of enslaved folks. And like you said, it becomes this like infantilization, but it's also like a mamification if we're going back to also like Patricia Hill Collins, right, and our understanding of like controlling images,
Yes.
people and enslaved folks became whatever white European settlers needed them to be for them to think at that time. So it becomes, I think, Dr. Jackson, Zakia Amin Jackson, who I think is at UCLA, calls it this plasticity, right? So like blackness becomes whatever you needed to, whatever way you need to mash the black silly putty and stretch us and overwork us and extend us, whether that be making us infantilized like children
Mhm.
or adultifying us. You can do all of this at once as long as it fits your European,
Mhm.
Eurocentric needs.
Yeah. And I mean, even if you look at things today, right, like the same exists, in
Mm-hmm.
terms of these images of Black folks, just like recreating or creating images that fit your story of what you believe Black folks to be, but also your story of that which will enhance and uphold your privilege, as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to taking it away. So like, um, yeah, I mean, the surrogate self is just like everything they needed to maintain that dream, that American dream, the freedoms. So, I mean, and I just think about like, I don't know, like they're like, without the minds, bodies, and souls of, you know, Black folks, like none of this would be, none of it, none of it at all. So,
Whew.
um, yeah.
And
But
even now,
I'm reading uh how the word is passed. That's what I'm reading right now by Clint Smith. And it
mhm,
talks about that basically, like all of these plantations, all of these, like all of these things, even kitchens, the way that food was cooked, like all of these technologies that existed then, right? Like, were created by Black folks, like, and many of them died creating those things. And then we talk about things like generational wealth. Like you would not have that wealth if it weren't for black bodies
mhm.
who created and worked tirelessly for you to maintain those things. So like yeah. I need to write down the name of the person you just said though at UCLA.
Yeah, I'm looking at this. Her book is downstairs, but she wrote "Becoming Human," um, is also literary theory. And so in
Okay.
Becoming Human, she's talking about this question in Black studies of are Black people human? And she's like, I know we have been talking about whether we're human or not, but I think we're missing the mark in that plasticity is really our conversation about when are we human and when are we something else in service of whiteness. Um,
Yeah.
because
Well,
she,
and it's just like when, like, right now, there's a lot of critique of, just to bring in some contemporary examples, a lot of critique of athletes who are demonstrating their humanness by saying, I'm tired and I can't keep doing this. And so, yeah, I know you want me to, and I know this is a big deal, but I'm not about to perform for you. And so, like, they are basically, like demanding that people see and hear them when they say, I am a human being and I deserve rest. I deserve, so. And a lot of Black women, period, I feel like when we say we're tired and we need a break, and that's okay, or no, not even all that, like, just nah, nah, I'm just gonna
and
pass
people
on
be
it.
like, what do you
What do
mean?
you
No.
mean?
What do you mean we can't extract more labor from
Right.
you? And I
So, and even when that labor is just for your visual pleasure, for you to see someone running down a field, or, like, I mean, down the track, or flipping like on a beam. So it's like, you know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah.
the same, it exists today, and it's just like a continuation of that surrogate self from that time. I mean, like, Black folks served in that manner before. Like, they created music and song, like danced, and like white folks just stood around listening, dance, and laughing, and like, are you entertained? Because we tired. Like, so
Yeah, and you bring up this point of like even Black entertainment has been painful. Like if we take it all the way back to when they used to dance the enslaved folks as
Mhm.
their exercise on the top of the slave ship, or even once we got to the ports, they will oil enslaved Black people up and make them like smile and dance and sing. So this idea of performance has always been wrought and fraught with pain of like being consumed, because you have that reception, right? Like as you cite the Olympics, Simone Biles, a disabled Black woman, because she has ADHD, right? And she's talking about my ADHD medication is not allowed in Japan, right? So she had mind body split, and she was like, "Oh no, I'm not about to destroy my body
And
for
that's
my."
someone with ADD. Like, when I tell you, if you are not like medicated, or if it's not under control, you can't function properly. I don't care what it is you're supposed to be doing.
And you want her
If
in the
it's reading a book or flipping.
and you want her in the air, and she doesn't know what her limbs are doing.
And then if she's been on that the entire time and then all of a sudden cannot, yeah, no.
But y'all want her to go win that medal for the good
I
old.
literally went and got my nails done, okay? Literally sitting there, went and got my nails done. She came on the TV in the nail salon, and a white woman was like, "Get her off the TV. Nobody wants to see her lazy butt." And I was like, "Ma'am,
Did you just call the most impressive? Because Serena is slowly slipping away, so Simone is now on record. Did you just call the most impressive athlete walking on the face of this green earth we got here, this floating rock, lazy? And that gets
you
me just
certainly did."
of a point that I wanted to bring up, even before we get to Olympic athletes, because there's a sheen of wealth and prestige to the Olympics. If we take it to essential workers, right, during the pandemic, essential workers at the grocery store, the post office, whatever, have been messaged as lazy, right? People don't want to go back to work because they're lazy. Essential and lazy. How do you put those
Even
together?
if you aren't essential, we're tired. People are tired. And y'all want things to be normal. There is no normal anymore. There is no such thing as normal.
And so even now we have this surrogate selfhood going on of like, we have wealthy white folks throughout the scope of influence, whether they be elected officials, whether they be people in technological advancement, right? Pioneers of industry, who are calling working poor and working class Black people lazy. But what you really mean is, I need you to do your labor so that I can explore the potential of these creative ideas I have. But if you're not doing your job and picking up my trash and bagging my groceries and stocking my shelves, I cannot be greedy. I cannot exploit wealth because I need everybody else to, I need somebody to exploit. How am I supposed to be great and live the American dream if you are not there for me to exploit you? How dare you? And so that is also what Morrison is getting at, of this idea of the European outcasts had this idea of their own power, but it still required somebody to be powerless. And
Mhm.
so when they were coming to understand themselves, in order to be powerful, they needed the enslaved Africans that they kidnapped off the coast and put to work in the field, right? Because power has to be in relation to something. They couldn't just be powerful on this land that they colonized if they didn't have somebody to put to work.
Yep. I mean, I got like on page 38, um, after she talks about Orlando Patterson. So in the next paragraph, at the beginning, the very first sentence, Black slavery enriched the country's creative possibilities. For in that construction of Blackness and enslavement could be found not only the not free, but also with the dramatic polarity created by skin color, the projection of the not me.
Woo! When I know her pen was hot, I know her pen was hot in 1992. I know what the projection of the not me, because again, like, Toni Morrison is doing something, an analysis of our psychological investment in literature.
Yes.
And that gets into CJ's next question of what becomes the role of literature in the making of the early American identity. And this part on 38 that she pointed us to, and then further on 39, where she says, earlier I said that the cultural identities are formed and informed by a nation's literature, and that what seemed to be on the mind of the literature of the United States was the self-conscious but highly problematic construction of the America as a new white man. Emerson's call for that new man in the American scholar indicates the deliberateness of the construction, the conscious necessity for establishing difference. So she talks about how, like, American literature was a psychological project of these
Mhm.
writers were out here writing characters so that white men knew what they were supposed to act like in relation to the savages, the enslaved, and the Black.
I mean, and literature is a form of media. Like in media informs how we act, like how we behave, how we dress, how we speak, like this, like we even now, like we learn about different characters and we might, like pick up certain, personality traits of those characters because they seem dope or something,
There's
you
a
know?
reason we read books to children in
Yeah.
their development. There's a reason why the Brothers Grimm and fairy tales, they're like morality plays. They're supposed to tell you how to act. You're supposed to act like the Cinderella and the Snow White and not the evil witches, the wicked witch of the West, right? You're
Yeah.
supposed to be Dorothy. You're supposed to be curious and get a lot of friends. You're not supposed to want vengeance on the girl who dropped the house on your sister, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So let's see. My pages are mixed up. Sorry.
Yeah. I'm just sitting here in awe as we do this deep study. And then as folks are watching who may not know, the anniversary of Morrison's passing is on Thursday, I believe. And so just being able to dive into her work with you, Dr. Carter, is just like, dang, like really one of the baddest literary minds to ever.
Period. I said that the other day with Juicy when we were discussing the first section. And I know she's difficult to read, but like, she's ours. You know what I'm saying? Like, when I look in the mirror, I know I'm a light-skinned Black woman, but I mean, Toni Morrison Black. It's a Black woman. You know what I'm saying? Like, it just tells me that, like, this is possible. Like, this is, so I feel like we do have a duty to read her work. Like, it is difficult, though. You might have to read it about 10 times, but it's fine.
That's a dedication to study, right? Like Toni Morrison, I think she even said this in her documentary, The Pieces I Am. She was like, you have to read and write and reread and then go look something up. And I call that reading. Yeah. So for Morrison, the study, the needing to do the footnotes and all that, she was like, oh, that's the bare minimum with me.
I mean, when I was reading her this section, well, actually the last section too, but when I was reading this section, I used it most, but I used the Oxford English Dictionary. So I can learn the history of these words and like different detailed definitions of it. And it's difficult to, unless you are like at a, educational institution or something, it's difficult to get your hands on one of those. But I feel like that is what it means. And sometimes I'll be sitting downstairs and I'll be reading it, like other books, other things by Morrison, or really reading, period. And I'll be like, hey, hey, Alexa. like you're not even supposed to say hey on Alexa. Yeah. You're supposed to say Alexa. It's usually hey Siri, which I ignore. My phone just started thing, but yeah, and I like look up the words because I want to know, like, am I reading this correctly? And then like and she's very intentional, like in word choice and who she's talking about in the text. And particularly in this one, the people that she talks about, like, are very much like these are things that we were supposed to read. These are things that have been assigned to us, like growing up.
Yeah.
And are considered very like, this is American literature and you're supposed to read it. And she's flipping that on his head, like, yes, a American history, a type of American literature.
Right. So, even in her life experience, again, I'm citing her documentary, The Pieces I Am. She talks about she got this indoctrination at Howard. She's like, the Howard English and theater departments were still like this. So I hope people keep that context in mind. Like when we're talking about the American dream and anti-Blackness and this impenetrable whiteness, she's not talking about it almost as exclusive to white people. She's like, there's an impenetrable whiteness, right? Like this general attitude about American literature and white characters and morality was still present at Howard University when she wanted to write a paper on Black characters in Shakespeare, and her department head was like, not gonna happen at all. Not happening.
Wow.
And so that's another layer, right? It doesn't just happen at the Harvards or the Ivy League institutions, right? How are American institutions holding up this idea of the American dream through this very narrow white literary imaginary, even at historically Black colleges and universities.
Yeah, I know somebody actually at the institution I work at in the English department who uses critical race theory to analyze Shakespeare. This is probably like this is what she wanted to do then, probably not using that theory necessarily, Paul, not at all, probably. But, like just, working through that literature, but you have people who were like, no, that doesn't uphold
You had the gatekeeping.
respectability, right? Like this is not what you do. If
This
you
is
want to add to it,
theater.
you add to it, but you're not going to critique it, okay? Not in that way. So,
It's not happening.
no.
And so that goes again with this, like, what is the role of literature in the making of the early American identity? It's not even just the early American identity. It's this constant, like, reworking. Because as we know about pedagogy, like, what you teach is reproduced. So if you are only teaching Faulkner, Poe, Twain, then when you're sending your students, the people you're educating out into the world, you're telling them that this is paramount. If you don't introduce children to Baldwin, to Morrison, to Hurston, and you're only teaching them these great white literary imaginaries of Joseph Conrad and others, then when they go out, their sense of what is important and what matters has already been shaped by what you offer.
Yeah. I think the only one I got, and it was in high school, was Invisible Man. And I mean, that's a powerful book, but that's not all we got. I mean, no
No
shade
shade.
about Ralph Ellison. But I mean, and I didn't go to high school. I mean, it was like a little bit long ago, but it wasn't that long ago.
You said we're not gonna do that. It wasn't like
I'll put a number out there, but yeah, I mean, it wasn't until actually I started a master's program in English that I was introduced. And can I tell you, like, women of color was part of a course called Experiential Women's Writing. It wasn't even part of like the general coursework at all. And then there was another course, Writers in the Harlem Renaissance. So those were the two courses that I got, like this diversity of, and no wonder why it took me so long to really come back to fiction, at least. Like I'm a huge like nonfiction person, but if you don't provide me with opportunities to see myself in literature, but you're telling me that this is like the literature of the time and it's all white folks, then I'm not going to care for it.
And then we get into this scarcity where I think you talked about representation and respectability earlier of like, if we introduce Black literature so late in people's educational or just developmental journeys, it gets to the scarcity mindset of we can't even get into critique of Black literature because people are like, oh, but this is what I was given, so it must be good. And it's like, we need to get into the weeds of Ralph Ellison's treatment of Zora Neale Hurston. But can we even get there if people are not given either of them in the classroom? We can't have Black literary traditions are full of such rich debate. Our folks used to get into it. Like, people always talk about Booker T. Washington and Du Bois. Ida B. Wells used to gather W.E.B. Du Bois in her living room and then write him a letter after. Like, have you read what we talked about? Because I need you to.
I know that Ella Baker ain't really jive with Martin like that. You feel me?
But we can't
he was I'm not gonna say what he is.
Cut the camera.
He just has some issues, as many people do.
Right? Our Black folk are complex, but that's part of like when we get into a Black literary imagination, which is where Toni Morrison points us in The Kindness of Sharks at the end of like, we need to talk about Africanist literature and get into the weeds and have conflict and dissect it as well. It's hard to get there when people are so invested in what they've been given because they're doing this binaristic this is the Black literature I've been given. I've only been able to read early American white men. Please let me have some. So please let me have my Invisible Man.
And then you don't want to critique it because it's like
It's all we
you
have.
feel bad for doing so.
It's all we have. And it's
But
like,
that's literary criticism. Like you're supposed to read something. Well, like as she said in the first section of this book, read it as a writer. When you begin reading as a writer, you read differently, and you are critiquing like everything from sentence structure to content to like
and
why
critique
did you pick this particular quote when there were like all
others.
these other things? Why the structure when you could have used this structure? But we are not taught to do those things.
And we're not taught to know critique can be thick.
Yeah.
We're taught that critique means that you are disposing, throwing away the whole. You can't critique something and be like, dang, I really wanted a richer character from this novel. And I think it's really good. I think your imagery is beautiful. And then we arrive at Morrison's thoughts around things like imagery, where we get CJ's final question of this section, where they say Morrison frequently invokes shadow, echoes, and ghosts to discuss the utility of Blackness and Black people in the white literary imagination. Why might such imagery be useful for her analysis? And we talked about it a little bit throughout each question of like the darkness that's on the other side of this impenetrable whiteness, about the savages and the shadows. Yeah. But I also think of it like linguistically of how often darkness is connected to badness.
Yeah.
And how
Like
you
what even like Black Friday, things like that, the black market.
and you really got to do work
Black
to change
magic.
your mindset around
Yeah.
darkness as absence or lack of.
Yeah, we're not there yet, but we will be doing discussions of the prophets by um my
Robert
Robert
Jones.
Jones Jr. And like that's one of the things I like about it is that the darkness is not a negative thing. So it's like
Yeah.
a counter narrative. But yeah, I mean, basically one of the things that I and exploring this idea of shadows, echoes, and ghosts is that enslaved black folks could be seen as two selves, really, like multiple selves. Like, so the present captive self that is in relationship to whiteness, but also their whole selves, like with this whole history and this knowledge and, um, you know, uh, love for community and the possibilities that get muted become silenced because of whiteness. So, and then I also think about shadows, echoes, and ghosts as like memories, like the things that even like remembrance of what was and what is, and so it's always there. Like,
Yeah.
um, and shadows are not necessarily a bad thing. But and I think that's what Morrison is saying, that the darkness actually, if you and in the final part of that section, darkness is what created freedom for white folks. Without that darkness, you wouldn't have all of these things. Like the darkness, you painted a picture of someone who was evil, but they cared for you. They
Mm.
protected you. They nurtured you. Like they fed you, they mothered you, like they all of the above. So they built all of these things, you know, like for you. It really was for themselves too to survive, but you
Yeah.
know. So I do like the focus on like shadow, echo, and ghost, and like this flipping it as like something that is um uh, connected to Blackness and Black people as that which is powerful and um, a wonderful thing. So I
Yeah.
like the ending of it.
I also thought about it in relation to surveillance, about how
Mm,
darkness allows you cover, like how the shadows were, and this also connects to the prophets, for folks who are going to read that with us, like cover from being watched, right? You escape in darkness. You seek freedom in darkness. You did not
yeah.
travel. You did not try to get free and go north at noon
Yeah.
on a Saturday. You waited till dark 30 and you
Oh,
crossed.
dark 30.
Come on. You crossed the river. You waited for Harriet and them under the cover of darkness, right? Black
Even
people.
the river is darkness. Like it's dark. Like you can hide within it. Where would you be without it?
Where would you be without darkness? What would you know without the shadows? Right? Like people even talk about, like, if you get into like hoodoo traditions and shadow work and shadow workings, and like the shadow is where you find reflection of
Mhm.
yourself, where you find a deeper knowingness. So even extending Morrison's literary work to literary traditions of African religions and African healing, like
Yes.
really get some deep like shadow work in there. Um, and understanding the ways that how even again our contemporary literature and media imagination demonizes the darkness, like the whole Princess and the Frog and the Voodoo Man. They said absolutely not, there will be no connection to any hope, or like this could be positive. They were like, we're gonna make a movie where the babies think that the Voodoo Man is the ultimate evil that there is, and that the shadows are the monsters. And so like even as you get into the and you continue through the 21st century, this constant white literary push to demonize the shadows is ever present. And I think that's also useful because for people who might not be familiar with your Faulkner, your Poe, your William Dunbar, you can connect it to moments like that of, have you read a children's book and the shadow has been the villain? Have you read a children's
Always. Like ghosts are things that are scary. They're hiding, you know, they come out, they're lurking, like these are
they're waiting to
they're
get you?
everywhere. We're taught to fear. We're taught to fear
Man.
these things. Yes. We're
Mm-hmm.
taught to actually fear our own shadow. Shoot. Like,
Right? Also, you're not supposed to even thinking about like the emotions that are connected to the shadows. Like you're not supposed to understand your anger or your sadness. You're supposed to constantly aspire, be happy, be positive, positive mindset. And
but
so,
there's a such thing as toxic positivity.
and Instagram is full of it.
Yeah, and if you don't deal with the shadow, if you don't deal with the trauma, basically, let's just talk about that. Like the trauma, then and the shadow is not necessarily like again, like this is like those memories are there. It's like reconnecting with those memories in order to reconnect with the self and to heal and to realize one's wholeness.
Yeah.
And without the shadow, you're not whole. So
And that's when Morrison leaves us at the very end of Romancing the Shadow, this section on page 59. Morrison basically brings us to where you just ended us off, Dr. Carter, when she says, if we follow through on the self-reflective nature of the encounters with Africanism, it falls clear. Images of Blackness can be evil and protective, rebellious and forgiving, fearful and desirable, all of the self-contradictory features of the self. Whiteness alone is mute, meaningless, unfathomable, pointless, frozen, veiled, curtained, dreaded, senseless, implaceable, or so our writers seem to say. So she's even like, dang, even in all of y'all's early American literature, the darkness and the shadows where all the fun stuff is happening. Y'all got all this purity and all of this meaninglessness happening, and all of your conflict, everything driving your plot is in the darkness.
yeah. Come on, Morrison, teach us, sis.
Come on. We honor, especially this week, all that you are in this work.
Yeah.
Well,
Well,
I would say, well, folks, that's
I
what we.
wish we would have had some comments, but I know y'all were thinking. I know we got you thinking. Because there have been people watching. So, but thank you for joining us today. And we have our next discussion. I believe it's the 18th of Playing in the Dark coming up. Make sure you go to the website and get your syllabus or syllabi, multiple, and do some reading. Pick up some Morrison.
Pick up some
Read
more.
it a few times. No. And thank you for joining us again. See you all later.
See you, everybody.